Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast for our final segment of the day, where I want to look at the top 10 teams according to the AP Top 25 preseason poll in college football, and just look at the schedules for each of their teams and look at the key spot where they are going to have to prove themselves to the country. And obviously a lot of very enticing storylines in college football this year with the conference realignments and some new coaches in new places, that there are a lot of legacy type conversations that are going to be had about this year, as it should be one of the most historic college football seasons that we have ever seen, especially with the expanded playoffs as well too. So a whole lot of different factors playing into it. From the top here, starting with the University of Georgia, where we saw Georgia coming off back-to-back national championships in 2021 and 22. 23 being a one-loss team. Feels like, they definitely had a case to be made for being one of the four best teams and making the playoffs last year, but so contested at the top that they are not let in. And this year, I don't know if it was directly because of that. They did beef up their schedule this year, especially in comparison to what was a little bit of definitely an easier, to say the least, regular season schedule last year. So, they have College Football Network has them with the 9th hardest schedule in the country. There's a number of key games to tune into. Love that week 1 matchup between them and Bama. Talk about them, scheduling more out of conference. Definitely a big one there. But the prove it game for them is going to be against Alabama in week 5 on the road in Tuscaloosa. We are now past the Nick Saban era for Alabama, and I do have faith in Kalen DeBoer being able to make the program his own and them still staying very relevant for years to come. But at this point, year 1 past Nick Saban, this is sort of Georgia's opportunity to show that they are the new kings of the SEC, have a chance to win 3 national championships in 4 years. So going into Tuscaloosa is obviously still a very tall task. And these prove-it games aren't necessarily must-win, especially for the teams at the top, where they can probably still make the playoffs with a loss or two anyways. But I do feel like this is going to be, if we're ever going to see Kirby Smart and Georgia establish themselves as the team to beat in the SEC post Nick Saban, it starts with this year, and a win in Tuscaloosa would do wonders for that little bit of a narrative. Number 2, we have Ohio State. Think that they have a pretty light schedule out of conference. It's 3 big games for them. It is at Oregon in week 7. It is at Penn State in week 10. But the prove-it game of obviously for Ryan Day at this point in his Ohio State career is getting that win versus Michigan. So finish off the season with Michigan. Of course, Michigan has won 3 straight times. Ryan Day yet to win the big one for Ohio State. And I'm definitely not panicking by any means for them. You remember early on at Harbaugh when he was in Michigan, and he lost his first 5 matchups versus Ohio State, and his job status was under question then. And that's kind of where we're at a little bit as well with Ryan Day. Now, it's not, completely eye to eye in that comparison. Michigan was in a much worse place when Harbaugh came in and took over. Ohio State, obviously, some different factors going on behind the scenes there with Urban Meyer, and it's not like they needed somebody to rebuild. They needed somebody to step in and continue to dominate the Big Ten the way that they were. And Ohio State's still been very good during Ryan Day's tenure there so far, but at the same time, those losses to Michigan, especially without a national championship, just weigh so heavy on the Ohio State faithful that, especially with Jim Harbaugh gone now, Sharon Moore taking over. Feels like, especially this year, having this game at home too, I believe, sort of has to be the prove-it game, not just for Ohio State and this season, but maybe for Ryan Day's continued career at Ohio State. Number 3, Oregon, their first season in the Big Ten. The games, they have games versus Ohio State at home and Michigan on the road this year. I think that Ohio State is going to be the one to really prove themselves that, Oregon and Ohio State are really being ranked, it seems like, by most people in that same top tier of the Big Ten. And then having, the Michigans, the Penn States maybe slightly below them. But having them at home versus the top dog in your new conference, winning this game for Dan Lanning and Oregon would be a massive statement. Another team that is new to their conference in the Texas Longhorns. I think there are a few candidates in this one as well. Michigan week 2 should be a great game and one that I am definitely keeping my eyes on as well. But this is really far more so about Texas being able to hold up in their new conference. And that's when you look at the SEC games and, really it's looking at that same sort of philosophy like we just talked about with Oregon and their game against Ohio State. For Texas, the prove-it game is going to be versus Georgia. Now, obviously, a tall task there, so you could also sort of argue as well the Red River rivalry against Oklahoma just a week prior. The combination of those games back-to-back in Oklahoma and then versus Georgia, that's a very tall task. So, I could give them a little bit of a pass for Georgia, but, at least if they were ever going to make a statement, that would, without a doubt, be the time to do so. And you're doing it at home. I feel like that is probably the closest you're going to get with Texas having that one individual game. I'd more so classify it as the stretch of versus Oklahoma, neutral site in the Red River rivalry, and then at home versus Georgia the following week. But Alabama, obviously new coach in Kalen DeBoer. They are at a point, Bama is, where they are going to need to step up in the conference, be able to show that they still got it. I just talked about Georgia and how their sort of prove-it game is against Alabama. You can make the argument that, Georgia's definitely the biggest game for Alabama this upcoming season, but I actually even more so look at the 3-game stretch that they have in late October to early November, because that's the point where Georgia is obviously the class of the SEC. I would argue at least at this point, and especially headed into next season, that the biggest thing with DeBoer is just showing that, Georgia's really good this year, but Bama is still in that top tier. So I look at stretch of at Tennessee versus Missouri and at LSU in a 3-game stretch there, a bye week in between the Missouri and LSU game. But against those SEC opponents, 2 of the games coming on the road, that's where I think sort of the most pressure is for Kalen DeBoer, and being able to show that Alabama is still, a name to be reckoned with in the SEC. So Georgia, you can absolutely make the case for that game being the situation as well. It being at home would definitely be a great statement win for DeBoer's new core, but I do think that it's sort of about showing it to the rest of the SEC as well, and showing that there's a reason it's Alabama and then some of those other teams that we just listed off. Number 6, Ole Miss. And for Ole Miss, I think that, again, like we were just talking about with Alabama, anytime Georgia is on the schedule, it's a pretty obvious, measuring stick as to where you're at. Being able to have Georgia at home on November 9th, that is definitely a big time spot for them to sort of at least get that game at home and try and establish themselves. You can put that in the conversation. I don't know if there's quite as obvious of a prove-it spot for Ole Miss. You can also put the 2-game stretch as well. October 12th at LSU, and then a bye week coming out of the bye week facing Oklahoma at home. I think that's another really big opportunity. I was thinking about it yesterday, and I feel like, I'm maybe not giving Ole Miss the credit that they quite deserve. Definitely some turnover on the roster that has me questioning a little bit. Are they going to be tough enough in the trenches? We will see. But I think that Ole Miss, again, I would probably lean either that Georgia game or the LSU game as well on the road. Last year, that game was a total classic. And, I think that those are probably the dates that I'm looking to with Ole Miss. Number 7, Notre Dame. Notre Dame doesn't have their usual, juggernaut of opponents that they have to face, which I think makes for a really interesting argument in terms of, how many wins or more so how many losses can Notre Dame get into the playoffs with. I kind of think that 2, it's still in the realm of possibility, but based off of how I think things are going to shake out, Notre Dame is probably, in my eyes, going to have to win 2 of their 3 games against opponents that are currently ranked. I know we're talking preseason rankings, don't mean all that much, but Texas A&M, Florida State, USC, those are really the only teams on their schedule that I think could be ranked by the end of the year. The rest of their schedule is pretty light. So when I'm looking at a prove-it game, I think that you look at November 9th against Florida State at that point, just being sure at week 9 as the playoff picture is kind of unfolding, having that game at home is a little bit of a statement to the committee as to why, again, maybe they lose week 1 on the road in A&M. Wouldn't be ideal for the resume, but early in the year as well, you're talking about playing your best football later in the season. That game at home against Florida State, I think, is going to be a crucial one. It's probably their toughest opponent, and if they can't take that game at home again, I think that the committee could very easily talk themselves out of Notre Dame in this new playoff picture as well that does sort of harm Notre Dame a little bit. That I think that it's going to be really important for them to take care of business. Again, I think they need 2 out of 3 against A&M, Florida State, and USC. I'm looking at that Week 9 Florida State game as sort of the one to really show what this Notre Dame team is about. Number 8, the Penn State Nittany Lions. For Penn State, it's a pretty obvious one, I feel like, and that's versus Ohio State at home in Week 10. We talked about it yesterday. Penn State has taken care of business for just about every team that they've possibly needed to play other than Michigan and Ohio State. And this year, no Michigan on the schedule. It's really going to be about that Ohio State game, in my opinion, for Penn State. They have some other good opponents as well. I think that at USC and at Wisconsin in back-to-back games could be a pretty difficult stretch headed into that Ohio State game. But again, Ohio State, we've seen Penn State be able to beat the vast majority of teams, but the big 2 in the Big Ten have been where Penn State just has not been able to sort of assert themselves as they are, on the same tier as them. They've been the little brother, so that's the game I'm 100% looking to. For Michigan, at Ohio State for their final game of the regular season sort of also has to be the pick. I don't think that Sharon Moore is going to be fully judged off of his success in the, Michigan-Ohio State rivalry in year 1, especially that it's on the road. I actually looked. ESPN Bet already has a line for that, and Ohio State's favored by 9.5 points. So, that's definitely sort of indicative, and I think probably fair as well, even though that's a game that we're talking about, in November already, so any betting line at that point is a little bit ridiculous. But I also think that considering Sharon Moore taking over his first season at Michigan, as much as that Ohio State game is ultimately someday going to be what Moore's legacy is sort of built upon, I also look at there's another really good opportunity for them to sort of make a name for themselves under Sharon Moore, and that is against Oregon on November 2nd in Week 10. That's going to be another team that, again, it's probably Oregon and Ohio State as the top two in the Big Ten. And then again, at this point, Michigan, with all of the roster turnover and the coaching turnover as well, that they are probably on that second tier of the Big Ten. But either one of these games would go a very long way for Michigan being able to, make that statement, say, we're still here, and be able to move on from there. But we did talk about, there are some obvious concerns with the Michigan roster this upcoming season and whether or not they are going to have a passing game. But finally, rounding this out here, number 10, we have Florida State. And ultimately, I do think that for Florida State, coming off of an undefeated season, they have a great chance, I think, once again to, they are the class of the ACC as things currently stand, probably going to punch their ticket into the playoffs by, taking care of business there. But, kind of the prove it game, I think, to some degree, and I think that they should win. But I think that game against Clemson at home, beginning of October 5th, that's kind of where I look at. And Dabo Swinney, I'm sure, still has the job security big picture here, but I don't know, maybe I'm kicking someone while they're down at this point, but I kind of feel like they have a chance to further, I don't know if bury Clemson is the right way to put it, but it's been very clear that Clemson's been struggling to hold their ground in the ACC these past couple years. Florida State has come back to prevalence and being able to take over sort of once again. And I think that there's a really good chance that this could sort of be the game for them where they say, actually, step aside, Dabo, we're the ones in charge here. And just for the overall, landscape of the ACC, that's the game I look at. I have some other big ones as well that I considered. At Miami should be a really good game. I'm high on Miami. And then at Notre Dame, like we had just talked about as well. So let me know which games you are most, looking forward to this upcoming season. Again, there's so much to cover college football wise. I'm going, close to 20 minutes here just talking about the top 10 teams alone and just their schedule. So a whole lot to dive into as the weeks come here. But that is all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Remember to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. Be sure to check us out on social media as well for more exclusive short content. And we will be back tomorrow afternoon, same time as always at 2 o'clock p.m. Eastern. We will see you then. Take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go.